All right, Shabbos say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Dr. Steve and Teri Czinn, for dedicating all of the Sherman Drushos this month in memory of Teri's father, Dr. Kahn, Tzvi Hirsh, ben Yosef HaKohen. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Zechariah ben Zechariah and Dinah bas Pesach. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Avi and Vivianne Zysman, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Avi's father, Yechiel ben Yechiel, Zichron Livracha. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Matt and Diane Marks, in memory of Matt's father, Charles Marks, Kalman ben Mordechai, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah, and the family in a chama shkoyach. All right, with that, let us begin a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. So today's daf is Nun Beis 52. We are picking up Emir Hashem on 51b. 51b. So the truth is, we actually left off, Nun Aleph on Beis. We actually left off a little bit. We'll start a little bit early where we left off. We're going to start with Tani Ula Bar Chanina. So we'll say this 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 lines up from the bottom. We actually got further in yesterday's daf, but let's just start it here. Just Emir Hashem, just to get started. So the Gemara says as follows: Tani Ula Bar Chanina. Meis shechaser, if you have a corpse that is deficient. So now, in actuality, there is a piece missing from the body. So what's the halacha? In lo rakev. So we'll say, first of all, there is no din of corpse dust for a deficient corpse. Next, v'lo tfusa. Well, we saw about this yesterday. This is if you go ahead and you move a grave. So the halacha is you have to take all the loose earth around the body as well as 3 fingers breadths of earth, we'll call it virgin soil all around it. V'lo shchunas kvaros. And the halacha is if you find 3 graves within dalet amos of each other, you have to assume that maybe this is a burial ground, and therefore have to search for graves at 20 amos out. So what the Gemara is saying, what Ula is saying is like this: if you find a deficient corpse, halacha l'maisa, again, all of these halachas don't apply to such a body. So Meisvei, Rabbi say, now of course, what we're all about. What are we all about? We'll say we are all rekev all the time, right? That's what we are, right? We are a single-minded, single-focused group, right? Corpse dust, right? So we'll say, so again, what catches our attention in this is the rekev, that a body that is not buried whole, right? A body that is not buried whole does not have a din of corpse dust. Let's challenge this. Meisvei, lo. Im amrith b'meis shishlo. So just to tell you the context over here. So the Rosh explains over here, lo im amrith b'meis b'meseches edios tani la upligi b'kizayis basar porish me'ever min achai. So I will say we're talking over here about a kizayis of flesh that is separated from the body. So I will say, so specifically kizayis of flesh from a living person. What is the status of that flesh in terms of tumah? I will say, so interestingly enough, so without getting into that machlokes, that's where this statement or this quotation is taken from. So listen to this. The Gemara says, "Beisei lo im amrit b'meis." So the Gemara wants to argue that perhaps a kizayis min hachai, a kizayis of flesh from a living body, does not go ahead and convey tumah like kizayis of a flesh from a dead body. Why? The Gemara says, "In loim amrit b'meish yesh lo rov," because remember again a v'rov v'rova. So ultimately, again, so the halacha is that a dead body is subject to the law of rov and also the law of rova, which is a quarter kav of bones, or malei tarvad rekev, or a ladle full of corpse dust. Tomar b'chai she'en lo rov, v'lo rova, v'lo malei tarvad. Right? Ultimately, again, a living person is not subject to any of these halachas. So I'll say what we're focused on is as follows: rekev hechi dami. Now, what's the case of rekev that the Gemara is talking about over here? The arkiv chad aver. We must be talking about again where there's decomposition of one limb. To which the Gemara says the kavase gabe meis, the parallel case by a dead person. Afilu chad aver ika rekev, which seems to indicate that's what I will say. By a dead person, even the decomposition of one limb would be problematic. They both say, what do you see from that? Now, if we're talking about the decomposition of one limb, what does it say about the rest of the body? That the body is deficient. And yet, ultimately, you're going to both say, obviously, a limb, right? One limb means the limb itself is deficient of the rest of the body. The rest of the body is deficient of the limb. And yet, what are we seeing? That there is a din of rekev, which would seem to contradict Ula, who said that the din of rekev does not apply to an incomplete body. Here we seem to indicate that in fact it does. To which the Gemara says, no. Mikatani ha-mace. I will say, does the Gemara telling us that every single mace that is deficient is subject to the laws of rekev? No. So the Gemara says, Hakamash Malon, Shum Meis Yesh Lo Rekev, Shum Chai Ein Lo Rekev. I will say the point that the Gemara is trying to make over here is that Halacha L'Maisa, there is a type of mace that is subject to the laws of rekev. What's the type of mace that is subject to the laws of rekev? I will say, what's the type of mace? Ultimately, a whole mace. But an incomplete mace, ultimately, again, is not going to be subject to the laws of rekev. So by Rava, Rava asked the kasha. By the way, I'll point out the Rambam paskins like Ula, namely that halacha l'maisa, the din of rekev only applies to a body that is buried whole, right? But a body that is deficient, ultimately again will not be subject to the laws of rekev. Good. Next, by Rava, another interesting case. Here, kiv kishu chai the chazra mace. So we'll say, listen to the following situation. Really very interesting. Let's say a person has a limb that has decayed. So the limb has essentially, I don't know what's the technical term. Gangrene, not amputated. The limb is still attached to the body, right? But ultimately, again, the limb essentially decayed. The limb is dead. The limb is dead while the person is alive. And now we'll say, now what happens? Now the person dies. So the Gemara says, so by Rabbi Herkiv Kishu Chai, so essentially the limb rotted while the person was alive, the chazra mace, and now the person died. So we'll say, what's the shaila? Mao. So we'll say the shaila is now, does this limb have a din of rekev or not? Now remember again, like the previous case, the person died, the body is intact. But in this case, part of the decomposition of the body took place while the person was alive. So I'll say, so the shaila is such a situation subject to rekev or not? So now, ki gemiri rekev da'akev kishu meis. Do we say the din of rekev is only when decomposition took place once the person died? Olduma hashta mia hamais. Do we say, look, now the guy's dead, right? Right now he's dead. The body is intact and the entire thing is rotting. So we'll say, so shaila is there a din of rekev in this case? Tashma. So we'll say the Gemara used the same quotation like we saw before, which was talking about kizayis min hachai. So the Gemara says, Tashma, loem amrit b'meis sheyesh lo rov v'rova malei tarvad rekev tomar b'chai. To which the Gemara says, Taima mishum chai. Now the reason the Gemara was making is that ultimately again, a chai, because the person is alive, that's why he's not subject ultimately to these other halachas. Ha meis yesh lo rekev. But you can infer from here that once the person dies, he's subject to rekev, even if one of the limbs had decayed while the person is actually alive. Also, if you take a look at the Rush quotes over here for just a moment. He says, not yet. To which the Gemara says, Mikatani, 4 lines up from the bottom. Mikatani hames, hakamash malan, the shum mes yesh lo rekev, shum chai ein lo rekev. Well, perhaps the Gemara is coming to teach me is that there are cases of a mace that ultimately are subject to rekev, but there is no case of a living person that is subject to rekev. Now, I will say, what would that mean for our case over here? So take a quick look at the Rush. So the Rush says over here, Shum meis yesh lo rekev, kishehir kiv achar moso, shum chai ein lo rekev, dim hirkiv bechayev afilu achar moso tar. I will say, what the Gemara seems to be saying over here is as follows. The case of rekev only applies when the body decayed before death. After death. When the body decayed before death, ultimately again, will not be subject to rekev. So I will say the 2 conclusions that the Gemara seems to be reaching is, number 1, they pass like Ula. Number 1, in order for there to be rekev, the body has to be whole at the time of death. Number 2, it only works if the decay happens after death. If the decay happens before death, ultimately again, body would not be subject to rekev. Incredible. Next. The Gemara says, Boy Rava. Both say second to last line from the daf, end of the daf. Boy Rava. Nemala shechasera mau. So we'll say this is an unrelated topic. The only reason why it's related is because, well, first of all, it's Rava. That's number 1. Number 2, we'll say is we're talking about deficiencies. So now he's switching gears a little bit to the concept of sheretz. So we'll say, so just to highlight this just a moment. Torah tells him not allowed to eat shratzim, creepy, crawly things. And we'll say in general, any israchila, right? What's the shear, right? What's the amount for an israchila? What's the kizayis? The exception to this rule is the concept of beria, right? Beria says that if you consume any prohibited item in its intact form, right, and it's a complete entity, even if it's smaller than a kizayis, you'll be chayiv. So, for example, a person eats an ant. So an ant is a sheretz. So an ant, of course, is going to be much less than a kizayis. Nevertheless, you are going to be chayiv for the consumption because an ant is a beria. An ant is a fully intact entity. Fine, most that's the concept of beria. So now watch this. By Rava, Nimala shechasera mau. So what's fascinating? What happens if an ant is missing a leg? An ant is missing a leg. Nebuch, right? Workplace accident, right? I said, right? The ant is missing a leg. So I'll say, so now the shayla is now you consume the ant. Are you chayiv or not? So I'll say, if you take a quick look at the Rosh for just a moment, by Rav Namala shechasera mau, Damar parak eluhin alokina ochel namala kol shu chayiv. Afapi she'in b'ke'adasha kizayis v'chela inyan tuma nami umibayle im miktitzu ragleha shadayin yechol lichyos im yesh she'in beria alav. So we'll say if a leg or legs of the ant were removed in a way that the ant could still survive. So halacha l'maisa again, does the ant still have beria status or not? So the Gemara says, what's the shayla? Mau shiura gemira la vaha chaser. So I will say, do we say that? Listen, the shear for an ant is a complete ant, and therefore, if you eat a legless ant, then what? It's deficient in the shear, and therefore you're not going to be chayiv. Oh, beria gemira la vaha. Maybe not. Maybe the definition will say beria is what? Is an ant that has the ability to live. Does this ant have the ability to live? Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say that's the shayla. So the Gemara says, beria gemir la va'ika, or maybe it just has to be a beria. Definition of beria is that has the ability to live, and that indeed that criteria has been met. So I'll say that's our shayla. Do we say that it's a din and a shear, right? And the shear ultimately is a complete ant with all of its legs, and therefore that's deficient over here, and therefore you won't be chayiv. Or no, the din is beria. Beria means something that can live. And the ant can live even without its legs. Top of nun base. I'm Rabbi Yehuda diskarta. So Rabbi Yehuda says as follows: Tashma, Bohem. So I'll say the pasuk says Elu hatameim lochem b'chal hasheretz ba'kol nogea Bohem b'mosamit ma'ner. So Thomas hasheretz. Right? If you go ahead and you touch the sheretz, you become tamei. So it says if you touch them, Bohem. So I'll say Yachal b'kulam. You might have thought you have to go ahead and come in contact with the entire sheretz. Talmud lomar mehem. The pasuk says later on, the chol asher yipol mehem. Mehem means from them. From them, I will say means that's what? Part of it and not the whole. So the Gemara says, Talmud lomar mehem. I mehem yachol miktsasan. You might have thought just part of the sheretz should be mitame. Talmud lomar bohem. So I will say, when it comes to the sheretz, I have contradictory terms. Torah uses lashon of bohem, which sounds like the entire sheretz. Then he uses lashon of mehem, which sounds like part of the sheretz. So which one is it? Do I need contact with the whole sheretz, with part of the sheretz? What's the pshat? It's ha-ketzad. So I'll say, how does this work? To which the Gemara says, 3 lines down from the top, on base medal of ha-ketzad. Ad shiga b'miktsasan shehu kakulan. So I'll say the halacha is that there will not be chiyuv until you touch part of it that is like the whole of it. I will say, now what does that mean? What does that mean? To which the Gemara says, v'shiru chachamim ke'adasha. Chazal said it's the size of a lentil, right? That there's ultimately only going to be some type of result or some type of impact when you touch a sheretz that is at least the size of a lentil. Now, both if you look at the Rosh for just a moment, v'shiura ke'adasha, the Rosh says, dahainu miktsasal v'karinan be'bahem lefi shachomet tchila briyasa b'chadasha v'hu shalem. So we'll say, so the minimum amount of sheretz for which there is liability will be the amount of an hadasha, will be the amount of a lentil. And we'll say, now where does that come from? Shekein hachomet tchilas briyasel b'chadasha. Because ultimately, again, we'll say the chomet, which is a type of sheretz, right? The chomet, when it's born, when it's created, ultimately, again, is the size of a lentil. So we'll say, so the chomet, therefore, is the smallest sheretz, and at birth, it is the size of a small lentil. So that becomes the minimum shear for sheretz impact. Now, what do you see from here? Shmamina shiuri gemirila. Now the fact that we say that the minimum size of a sheretz that could generate liability is the size of an adasha. Why? Because a chomet, right, when it's born, is the size of an adasha. Now the truth is, there's something smaller than an adasha. What's smaller than an adasha? A chomet without legs. So it's a good riddle, right? So what's smaller than an adasha? Chomet without legs. Now the fact that we don't go and entertain that shear tells us that what? That ultimately, again, the shear for sheretz is an intact sheretz, a fully intact sheretz. So therefore, I will say, based on this, the Gemara would say that halacha l'maisa. What does that tell you? That an amala missing legs, an ant missing legs, would what I will say be a deficient sheretz, and therefore would not carry with it liability. That's what it seems to be saying over here. To which the Gemara says, I will say, first of all, take a look at the Rosh for just a moment. Shmamina shiura gemiri di amrit dinamala sheniktas ragleha karuya beria. Because if you're going to say, says the Rosh, that an ant missing its legs is going to be called the beria, he goes on, he says, Ein ba kadasha tetchilas priyasa kishu shalim ein ba ela kadasha v'nefmeh tepachos mi kadasha metame. Fine. So I say, therefore the Gemara says, maybe not. Amar Shmaya, maybe not. Kiba inan shiura. The Gemara says, Debelo havia kadasha lo metame, delo nafla banashama. I will say, maybe the halacha is as follows. When do we say that the sheretz requires a complete shear? That's at the moment of its creation. Right? At the moment of its creation, it requires a complete shear. I will say, Aval, nafla ba neshama lo. I will say, but maybe once, in other words, the Gemara is saying like this. What's the shear of a sheretz? The Gemara said like a chomet. Right? So we'll say, what's the size of a chomet? Like the size of a lentil, small lentil. When do we require that shear? We'll say, when the sheretz is first born. But maybe once the sheretz is born, so to speak, it's alive. So we'll say, what happens once the sheretz is born, it's alive? Now, it's endowed with sheretz identity. Well, now, once it's already endowed with sheretz identity, then maybe what? Maybe if it becomes even a bit deficient, it still retains that identity. We'll see, you hear what we're saying over here? In other words, to get sheretz identity, you have to meet a certain threshold. What's the threshold? What's the threshold? We'll call it chomet threshold. What's chomet threshold? The size of a lentil. But once you've met that threshold, maybe even if something happens subsequently to make you deficient, you still retain that identity. Interesting idea. And therefore the ant, even if it subsequently goes in and loses a leg or two or three, Lamaisa still retains its nemala, its ant identity. A fascinating havamina. So the Gemara says, but once it's alive and already has its sheretz identity, then halacha lamaisa, perhaps that identity should remain with it even if it becomes deficient. I just pointed out something amazing. What an incredible idea in Ruchnius as well. So I'll say it works the same way in Ruchnius. In other words, let's say once a person reaches certain metrics in their spiritual development, even if you backslide, which inevitably happens to all of us, you still retain certain key components of spiritual accomplishment. I will say this is why it is so important to push ourselves in Ruchnius, right? It's not just enough to set easily attainable goals. A person has to push themselves, because what ends up happening is if I push myself and I attain something, even if I subsequently backslide, that certain aspects of that spiritual attainment and that spiritual accomplishment remain with me even if I become deficient. I suppose because like the ant, what often ends up happening in life, I go ahead and I'm doing my thing, right, and I'm accomplishing, and then what happens? I lose my legs, figuratively, right? In other words, I lose my legs, I lose my footing, I make a mistake, I fall down. But when I've locked in certain levels of spiritual accomplishment, those pieces are there with me even when I fall. And it's that very locked in accomplishment that allows me to, I will say, whoever thought that you could gain so much chizuk from a legless ant? What I will say, because the truth is, I'm that legless ant, right? I identify as that legless ant. I don't mean it like that, but just like, please use ant as my pronouns, right? So I'll say, so again, right? So I identify ultimately again as that legless ant. In other words, I'm that entity who has gained. I'm that entity who has gained identity, but then at times lose elements of that identity. But the Gemara is saying over here is once you've locked it in, it's yours. Doesn't mean you can't lose it, but ultimately, even when you lose some of it, you retain so much more. Also, that's why again, so important to push ourselves harder and harder and harder, so that when we fall and fail, which we will, ultimately again, there are parts of my identity that I'm still able to retain. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Tibai lecha. So once the Gemara ultimately says, that's the kasha. That's the kasha. So there was, interestingly enough, the Gemara does not end off with a resolution. Right? So also, I'll tell you, interesting, so the Rambam, how does Rambam Paskin in this case? So what happens with the legless ant? So the Rambam Paskins, it is in Hilchos Ma'achalos Asuros, Perek Beis, Halacha Chav Beis. The Rambam writes, he says, Mimola shechaser afilu achas miragleh, eino lo ge'aleh, ela b'kizayis. So I'll say, this is fascinating, right? So, well, listen to this. If you eat an ant, a fully formed ant with all of its legs, you're chayiv. How big is an ant, right? Tiny. Once the ant is missing a leg or more, and by the way, leg is just an example. In other words, once the ant is missing some part of it, then I'll say it's no longer a beria. Once it's no longer a beria, it's governed under the rest of the halachas of ma'achalos asuros, forbidden foodstuffs. And there I will say, you'll only be chayiv if you consume what? A kizayis. So I'll say, so again, an intact ant, you're chayiv, by the way, seven different isurim for consuming it. Right? Once you eat a legless ant, you're only chayiv if you consume a kizayis of legless ants. Okay? Incredible. Sorry?
Cut the leg before you eat it.
I'm sorry?
Cut the leg
before you eat it, right? Minimize the isser. Right? If you can't resist the taiva to eat an ant, it's very true. You can at least minimize the isser by plucking off a leg. Yeah, good. If you're at that level of cheshbonos, we probably should schedule a time to meet. Right? Good. It says where it's right there. So Hashedra will go. That's right. But it is a good eitzah. Listen to this. Next. The Mishnah said, going through the list of things that create tumah exposure. Shedra and Gilgolas. All right, we're so behind. Okay, good. Shedra and Gilgolas. Good. We're fine. Listen to this. So remember, skull or Shedra is the spinal cord, and Gilgolas is the skull. So say now the Gemara has an interesting question. Shedra v'Gilgolas tanan, o dilma o Shedra o Gilgolas. So I'll say, here's the shaila. When the Mishnah says that the skull and the spine convey tumah, is that the skull and the spine together? Or is that either the skull or the spine? That's the shaila. So the Gemara says, Amarava, Tashma, Shedra, Shegirer, Rov, Eloin, Sheba, Tahora. We'll say if you have a spinal cord, and you removed all of the ribs from that spinal cord, Tahora. Ultimately, again, such a shedra does not convey tumah. Ubekever, but again, if this is in the grave, afilu mishuberes and mufarekes timeah. Also, it's very interesting. In the grave, ultimately, again, even if the ribs are broken off of the spinal cord, or even if the spinal cord itself is not fully intact, ultimately it still conveys tumah. Why? Mipnei hakever. That was actually quite interesting because halacha l'maisa, the grave brings everything together. The grave, right? What the grave does is the grave is the great unifier of the remains, right? And therefore, again, even if the remains are separate and disparate, the grave brings them together. I will say, by the way, an incredible Moshe Haskell as well. The grave brings everything together. So I will say, at the end of the day, our lives are often made up of a series of disparate or what we think are a series of disparate and disconnected actions and decisions. But after 120, the grave brings everything together, making that into a great tapestry of my life. So often we do things in a disconnected fashion. But just know that one day, the grave brings together the entire cohesive narrative of my life, and we should make sure that it's something that we're proud of. So the Gemara goes on, the Gemara says, The Gemara says, Taima Mishum Digirar. Now the reason why the spinal cord will not convey tumah is because the ribs were removed. Halo Girar Tameh. But if you did not remove the ribs, the spinal cord itself would convey tumah. So we'll say, so what does it sound like? It sounds like the spinal cord itself, without the skull, conveys tumah. Shmamina o shedra o gugolas katani. I will say, see from here that it's not both. It doesn't have to be the skull and the spinal cord, but rather it's either or. To which the Gemara says, halo katani, hakamash malan. So the Gemara says that it's actually not addressing that. Hakamash malan dechigira tahora. So I will say, all the Gemara is telling me now is that if the ribs are removed from the spinal cord doesn't convey tumah. The Gemara is not addressing whether or not it needs to be the skull and spinal cord together. So in other words, what the Gemara is just telling me is, our Gemara is not discussing that detail. So that question still remains extant. So Gemara says, Tashma, still trying to solve this question. Tashma, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shisha Dvar Rabbi Akiva Metarim. There are 6 things that Rabbi Akiva said are tameh, and the Chacham said are tahar. The Chazer bo Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva subsequently retracted his position. So Gemara tells a story. Listen to this story. I'll say, one time, they brought a basket filled with bones to the shul of the Tarsiyim. They both say, Tarsiyim, the Rosh says, are Tsarfei Nechoshes, copper smelters, right? Copper workers. So one time they brought a basket of bones to the shul of the copper workers. They left it outside. The Rebbe say it was a very good idea that they left it outside. Why? Because obviously if they brought it inside, you run the risk of tumas ohel. And besides that, it's also good. It's not good to bring a basket of bones into shul. So I'll say again, same thing like don't come with a shopping bag of snacks with your kids to shul, right? Let them eat at home, right? But I said don't come with a basket of bones, right? Those are two things. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, so ultimately again, venichu ba'avir. So they left him outside. Venichu ba'avir. V'nichnas todos harofe, v'chalarofim imo. And we'll say, so Todos, the doctor, and some other doctors came along, and we'll say, now what are they trying to examine over here? What they're trying to figure out, we'll say, is, remember, to a layman, all you see is a basket of bones. You don't know what the bones are. And we'll say, what else don't I know? I also don't know one body, 2 bodies, like what's going on over here. And remember, as we've seen before, all of that could have a potential impact, like Avi Tumas Mace. So Todos and these other doctors came with him. Right? Va'amru ein kan shedra mimeis echad. There is not an intact spinal cord from one corpse. So we'll say taima deleka shedra de mechada. They both say now the reason ultimately again that this did not convey tumah was because there was not an intact spinal cord from one mace. So the Gemara says, Ha'ika, O Shedra, O Golgolas de Mechada, Nazir Megaleachala. Sounds like from here, had there been an intact spinal cord or an intact skull from one mace, that would have been the type of tumah that would have required a Nazir to shave. In other words, to end his Nazirus. So we'll say, what do you see from here? Shmamina, O Shedra, O Golgolas Tanan. We'll say, what do you see from here? How should you read the Mishnah? So we'll say, either one. In other words, you see from here, from Todos' testimony, I don't need a spinal cord attached to a skull in order to convey tumah. Rather, it's either a spinal cord or a skull which conveys tumah. To which man says, no. Lomi by kamar. Lomi by shedra v'gulgol semes echad leka ela afidu shedra mes echad or gulgol semes echad leka. And I will say, that's not what Todos was saying. Todos was saying, not only is there not an intact skull and spinal cord unit together, but there's not even an intact spinal cord or a skull from one mace. Shabbos says, so therefore, again, the Gemara says you can't bring a raya from the statement of Todos. Next, Tashma, Miminyana. So the Gemara says, Umahin, Shisha Dvarim Shrabi Yakiva Mitami, Chamtar. So we'll say, so remember again, the Brisa said before that there were 6 things that Rabbi Akiva was Mitame and the Chachamim were Mitayar. So we'll say, so remember again, just to keep our focus, we're focused on one simple question, which is, the Mishnah says that exposure to a skull and spinal cord ultimately, again, is the type of tumah that would cause a Nazir to end his Nazirus, have to start over, and go through all of the shaving and sacrificial rites associated with tumah. I will say, now what's our shayla? How do you read the Mishnah? Is it Gulgoles V'Shedra? Is it skull and spinal cord? Or is it skull or spinal cord. So we'll say, so now watch this. We said before, 6 cases Rabbi Akiva said Tameh, Chacham said Tar, and Rabbi Akiva retracted. We'll say, so what are the 6 cases? Here we go. Alever min hameis, Shabbat mishne mesim. So we'll listen to these very interesting cases. Let's say you have a limb that came from 2 corpses. Then we'll say, now, what does that mean? What does that mean? So we'll say, if you take a look, I'll just say this outside. So the case where I will say is, if you can imagine, you have an arm. You have an arm that came from a corpse. So I will say, but in this case, the reconstructed arm came from 2 corpses. Right? So you have a half an arm from corpse A, half an arm from corpse B, but together, they form a fully formed arm. So I will say, so now, right? So I'll even min hameis sheba mishne mesim. It's case 1. Case 2, I'll even min hachai sheba mishne bnei adam. Or I will say you have a limb, right? A complete arm, but again, half of that arm came from Reuven, half of it came from Shimon, who are both alive. But together, the 2 parts of the arm form a fully formed limb. Next, al chatzi kav atzomas sheba mishne mesim, or a half a kav of bones, which came from 2 corpses, or revius dam haba mishnayim, or we actually saw this case before, or revius of blood that came from 2 corpses, val etzem kisaora shenechlak l'shnayim, or ultimately again, a bone fragment that is the size of a barley kernel that ultimately again that was split, that came from 2 masons. I'm sorry, shenechnach l'shnayim. This case is it was split into 2. Vashedra v'halgogolas, and ultimately again the spinal cord and the skull. So I'll say these are the 6 cases in which Rabbi Akiva argued the Chum. Rabbi Akiva was Metame, Chachamim were Mitar. Rabbi Akiva subsequently recanted. Amud Beis. So the Gemara says, 1 second. These Sagadai O Shedra O Gulgoles. But if you want to tell me that it's a case of not Shedra and Gulgoles together, we'll say, but rather what? Either, in other words, they're independent. They're dependent. Then I will say, Hani Shiva Havyor. It's not 6 cases, it's what?
7.
It's 7 cases. In other words, if you read the Brisa as Shedra, bless you, as Shedra v'Gulgoles as 1, then 6 works. But if you understand, but that only works if you count spinal cord and skull as one entity for Tumah. But if, on the other hand, you entertain that Shedra and Gulgoles are independent of each other, they work independent of each other, then it's not 6 cases, it's 7 cases. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Ki katani kolecha de pligi ale rabim. I will say the truth is, we're only including in this list cases for which there is a group which argues on Rabbi Akiva and not a yahrzeit. Therefore, I will say we have to take out the case la fuki etzem kisaora. Take out the case ultimately again of the case of the bone fragment. That is the size, ultimately, again, of a wheat kernel. Why? The yahrzeit to polygale. Because we'll say, as much as it's faced the Chachamim, it's not really that case. That case is actually only an individual who argues on Rabbi Akiva. Who's arguing on Rabbi Akiva in the case of etzem kisar? The sanya, etzem kisar shenechlach l'shnayim. If you have a bone fragment the size of a wheat kernel that was split into 2, Rabbi Akiva metame, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri mitar. Rabbi Akiva says it's tamei. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that it's tar. So I will say again. So just understand what's happening over here. Let's pause. Right? 6 cases in which Rabbi Akiva argues on the Chachamim. In these 6 cases, Rabbi Akiva says tamei. Chachamim say tar. Naturally, subsequently Rabbi Akiva retracts his position and agrees with the Chacham. We'll say, what's case number 6? What's case number 6? Shedra v'Gulgoles. Now I will say now again. When you read that, it's placing Shedra v'Gulgoles in 1 unit, which makes it sound like what? Then halacha l'maisa, Shedra and Gulgoles, spinal cord and skull, are 1 unit. Okay, so I will say, so the Gemara says, so if you want to say, however, that Shedra and Gulgoles do not need to be connected, they're 2 separate things, that means they're 2 separate machloksim. If they're 2 separate machloksim, then what? There are 7 cases that Rabbi Akiva disagrees, not 6. So we'll say what we're attempting to do now is reconcile that reality with the number 6. So how do we get back to 6 in the Brisa? So therefore, answer number 1 is take out a case. Which case should you take out? The case of etzem kisaora. Why, I will say? Because the Brisa only includes cases where Rabbi Akiva is arguing with a group. It does not include cases where Rabbi Akiva is arguing with an individual. What's the case of Rabbi Akiva arguing with an individual? Atzem kisor shenechlak l'shnayim. The case of a bone fragment that is the size of a wheat kernel that was split into two. Because that's not a case of, that's not a machlokes Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanon, that's a machlokes where? Rabbi Akiva and, or who? Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So take out that case. What's the beauty if you take out that case? What's the beauty if you take out that case? Order is restored to the world. Now I have 6 cases in the Brisa, not 7. Beautiful. Beautiful. Both I just want to point out, we've switched gears here. All we've done now, so remember, our overarching question is still unanswered. What's our overarching question? Skull and spinal cord, right? Shedrin Lugolas. Do they have to be an intact entity together, or are they even metame separate? Ibai Sema, so it's another way to reconcile the Brisa. Ibai Sema, Ki katani Avram min Ames, Avram min Achai, Lo katani. So we'll say perhaps, ultimately, again, the Brisa only means to include Avram min Ames, not Avram min Achai. Fine. So we'll say, take out the case of Avram min Achai. And therefore, again, we're back to 6. Ibai Sema possibilities, Ki katani, Kol heichad the Nazir megalech ala hilo. Furthermore, I will say, could be, the only cases included on the Brisa, types of tumah, that if a Nazir, that could ultimately, again, be metame a Nazir through tumas ohel. But any type of tumah, which would not impact the Nazir through tumas ohel, perhaps should be excluded. Therefore, what we exclude from here, la fuke, etzem kisora dilo. We'll say etzem kisora is not metame through tumas ohel, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, we could remove that, and therefore, we're back at 6. The possibility is the hadirbe la fuki revius dam de lo hadirbe. Oh, very interesting. Another possibility is mostly when it says 6 refers to the number of cases where Rabbi Akiva changed his mind, and subsequently agreed with the Chachamim. But I will say there was one case where Rabbi Akiva did not change his mind. What was the case? Rabbi Akiva didn't change his mind. Revius dam. I will say, remember again, what's Revius Dam? Revius Dam is if you have a Revius of blood that comes from 2 corpses. Rabbi Akiva said it's Tameh, Chacham said it's Tar. I will say that's the one case Rabbi Akiva did not change his mind. After all, because we learned Amalei Rebbe, the Bar Kapra, Rabbi said the Bar Kapra, or Bar Kapara, Lo Tishne Revius Dam Bechazara, do not say that Rabbi Akiva retracted his position by Revius Dam, Shari Limudo, Rabbi Akiva Biado. Because Rabbi Akiva's position, I will say, is still intact. Va'od hamikra Messiah. Furthermore, Rabbi Akiva has a pasuk that supports him. I will say, what's the pasuk that supports him? Va'al kol nafshos meis lo yavo. Remember, we actually had this before. We had the before. We'll say the pasuk says, "Al kol nafshos meis." We'll say nafshos is plural. So Rabbi Akiva dashes. What do you see from here? That even a revius of blood that is made up of blood from 2 different corpses still has the ability to go ahead and convey tumah. So we'll say, so just want to point out, just to understand what's happening over here. So what the Gemara is suggesting is like this. Very exciting. When the Gemara says that there are 6 cases in the Brisa where Rabbi Akiva argued on the Chachamim, that refers to, in reality, we'll see how many cases are in the Brisa. How many cases are there? There are really 7, right? Because Shedra and Gilgol, that's really 2 separate cases we're suggesting. When it says 6 refers ultimately again to the number of cases Rabbi Akiva changed his mind and came to agree with the Chachamim. But there's one case Rabbi Akiva did not change his mind. What's the one case? The revius of blood made up from 2 corpses. That case, Rabbi Akiva held his ground and said, no, that is metame. And the Gemara says, good as he held his ground, because truth is, he has a pasuk that supports that assertion as well. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon says, Ad Yamav Hayimitame. Now, we'll say, by the way, who is this Rabbi Shimon? This is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. This is Rashbi, right, who was a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, Ad Yamav Hayimitame. All the days of Rabbi Akiva's life, he ultimately, again, was metame. He held his ground and he said that blood that comes from 2, or revius of blood that comes from 2 corpses, ultimately, again, is metame. Im mishemeis chazer bo eni odea. Look, if when he died, he retracted, I don't know. Now, we'll say, now watch this. This is incredible. Now, we'll say, obviously, that statement of if he died when he retracted, it's like a shtickle sarcastic. So the Gemara says, Hushchuru shina mipnei Tani Yosef. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yochai had such remorse that he made a sarcastic statement regarding his Rebbe that he launched into a series of fast days. So many fast days that his teeth blackened from hunger. I would say such an incredible statement. So you see the Talmud so distressed. And again, I would say, is it such a big deal? The truth is, had the Gemara not even said that last piece, I wouldn't have even interpreted this statement as being anything sarcastic. But from Rashbi's reaction to his own statement, you see that he felt that there was some degree, some little bit of cynicism or sarcasm towards his Rebbe. He felt that it was such a lack of kavod towards his Rebbe that he undertook these fast days. Absolutely incredible. So again, he writes over here, Rashi writes over here, Lefisha derech ginai haya mishtaya leid Rabbi Akiva baram mishemeis chazaro. He just felt he felt it was not the proper derech eretz, not the proper kavod, and somewhat disparaging of his Rebbe. Just incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. So Tashma. So I'll say, I just want to point out, so bottom line, okay, we reconcile the Braisa, we still have not answered our question, right? In other words, our overarching question of, do the spinal cord and skull work independently or together? So I'll say that we still have an answer. So Tashma. Beishamai says, Rova. Right? Ultimately, again, a quarter kav of bones have the ability to be metame ba'ohel. Rova tzavos minat samim. O mishnayim o mishlosha. So I'll say ultimately again. So if you look at Rashi says over here, Beishamai Omrim is right across. Rova atzamos min atzamos shalu mishvatam ba'oel umazem mishlishi kagon sheba mishnei atzamos o mishlosha atzamos aval lo me'etzem echad. So I'll say interesting that Beishamai says when we say that a quarter kav of bones has the ability to convey to us ohel, that's only true if ultimately again it's coming from at least 2 or 3 bones. Beis Hillel says Rova min hagavia merov habinyan or merov haminyan. Beis Hillel says it's either again the majority of the body, either ultimately again from the majority of the gavia from the body, or majority of the number of bones in the body. I'm Rabbi Shmuel said, we'll explain this in just a moment. Yeshua says, I can reconcile the positions of Beishamai and Beis Hillel like one. Beishamai omrim mishnayim o mishlosha. Beishamai says that's the 2 or 3 bones. So the Gemara says, "O mishnei shokayim v'yarak echad." It could be from 2 shin bones and 1 thigh bone. O mishnei yerechayim v'shok echad. Or it could be ultimately again 2 thigh bones and one shin bone. And I will say, what does that do? So it satisfies 2 or 3 bones, but it's also rov gofal shel adam gofal. Those bones also represent the majority of a person's height. And I will say, ultimately, again, you'd be able to reconcile both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel's opinion together. Beis Hillel says, Beis Hillel omrim min hagavia merov habinyan. Ultimately, again, the majority of the body, right, or majority of the height, or the height of the individual, or merov minyan, or the majority of the number of bones. Hoil v'yeshnan the nefarek yadayim v'raglayim. Because we'll say, ultimately, again, it includes, it could also include in the tally of this, the majority, the joints of the hands and the feet. That would also comprise the majority of the body. Shammai omrim afilu etzem min hashedra min hagolgolas. Shammai says even a bone from the shedra or the golgolas, even a bone right from the spinal cord or from the skull. So Gemara says, so what do you see from that? You see from that. I will say, by the way, all of that was just to go ahead and help us understand that what it could even be a quarter kav of bones from the skull or from the spinal cord. So we'll say, what do you see from here? It's either. To which the Gemara says, shiny Shammai de Machmir. Ultimately, again, I will say, but you can't bring it right from here. Why? Because Shammai is Machmir. To which the Gemara says, Livshot mine taima Shammai Machmir harabanan adiiga shidra vigolgola. So we'll say, we're going to stop over here today because I don't want to. We already rushed a little bit. We'll stop over here today. We'll say, bottom line. We're leaving this unresolved. Although we'll say, we'll leave off actually with the proof / question. It sounds like from Beis Shammai that it's either shedra or gilgolas. You don't need both. Resolution to this question. And we have Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach.